Although there are a litany of Marvel characters involved in a constant struggle with being misunderstood, there isn't a group who fit that bill more than the X-Men, both in continuity and out of it. Marvel's mutants have been around the block multiple times, debuting first in 1963. Their popularity would wane and rise in the decades following, but now, with a movie franchise under their belt, dozens of video games and animated series to their name, and with thousands of issues to boot, there isn't a Marvel team quite as iconic. Unfortunately for the group, such popularity has brought with it its own share of challenges, including a selection of misconceptions that would make even Venom himself blush. I'm Yoon from What Culture, and here are 10 things everyone always gets wrong about the X-Men. Number 10. Cyclops is a jerk. To the uninitiated, Scott Summers, aka Cyclops, probably sounds like a massive jerk. In the X-Men movies, he does nothing except bark orders and act creepily possessive over Jean Grey. Other depictions haven't fared well either, relegating the character to a one-dimensional hero who can effectively be summarized as teacher's pet. The actual truth of the matter is a lot more complex, and one need only consult a few X-Men comics to understand that Summers is infinitely more compelling than his appearances in other media would suggest. He plays things by the book in a lot of cases, but he's also someone religiously devoted to the campaign for mutant rights. Said devotion has led him to split away from the main X-Men, fight with the Avengers, and even resulted in the death of Professor X. Although the latter example is unlikely to convince the character's biggest detractors that he isn't a figure to be reviled, there's plenty more to Summers than his Boy Scout persona and his relationship with Jean Grey. There's genuine passion behind the character, and with those optic blasts able to do immense amounts of damage, he's not one to be taken lightly either. Number 9. The best X-Men era. Unfortunately, despite the X-Men being able to boast a vast and iconic bibliography, they haven't been the most welcoming of teams to new readers. The X-books boast a thick and sometimes impenetrable continuity that always comes into play somehow, and with the team's peak said to have come in the early 90s, it's understandable why some true believers have resigned themselves to never getting into the group's antics, with over 40 years of backstory to unpack. However, what's past is past, and since the turn of the century, a number of truly brilliant X-Men runs have made their way onto shelves. Grant Morrison and Frank Quitely did wonderful things in New X-Men, and Joss Whedon boasts a tremendous stint on Astonishing X-Men with artist John Cassaday. Add to that the recent contributions of Tom Taylor and Mahmoud Asrar in X-Men Red, and it's clear as day that the group never really left. They just weren't as popular as they once were. Speaking of, the team's peak, widely considered to have occurred during the early 90s, where artist Jim Lee redesigned their looks, isn't that spectacular. Yes, Chris Claremont's work is still untouchable, but that early period was convoluted, oversaturated, and benefited from a resurgent interest in the X-Men brand, courtesy of the 90s animated series. Point being, just because the team were at their peak doesn't mean it was their best era. Number 8. The Dark Phoenix Saga. The Dark Phoenix Saga is perhaps the most famous of all X-Men stories, yet it's been disastrously misrepresented in other media. Twice. Okay, Dark Phoenix is yet to release, but still, most of the story's cosmic elements look as though they've been reduced to a short 10-minute introduction, and most of the film appears to be a retread of X-Men The Last Stand, demonstrably the worst of all the old X-Men movies. Of course, anyone familiar with the actual Dark Phoenix story will tell you that its best elements were its cosmic ones, which took a back seat in 2006 and look to be taking a same place in the upcoming movie. No doubt this has convinced many a fan that the Dark Phoenix Saga isn't half as epic as its name would suggest, but that couldn't be further from the truth. The actual story involves a group known as the Hellfire Club, the Shi'ar Empire, and boasts a terrific third act whereby Jean Grey is put on trial in space. Compare that to what was seen in X-Men The Last Stand and the upcoming Dark Phoenix, and the difference is clear as day. Number 7. Magneto and Xavier's friendship. Contrary to popular belief, Magneto and Charles Xavier aren't the pally-pals they've been held to be in recent years. Eric Lenscher was never involved in the founding of the X-Men, and he and Professor X first encountered each other briefly in Israel, where they debated the mutant rights movement. There isn't a friendship there so much as there's a mutual respect for each other, with both fighting for the same cause, though obviously through contrasting means. This dynamic was portrayed brilliantly on screen by perennial bromance artists Patrick Stewart and Ian McKellen, but in the years since, writers have attempted to insert more emotional backstory to the pair's rivalry, forgetting that it was their intellectual sparring that made the relationship so compelling in the comics. So, think of them less as friends in the traditional sense and more as the civil rights analogues they were originally conceived as. It served them well for decades, after all. Number 6, Wolverine has to be everywhere. Wolverine may not have joined the X-Men until the late 1970s, but today, having starred in multiple films, solo comics, and animated series, it's pretty evident that he's eclipsed the team he came from. The character is so popular, not without good reason, but that hasn't always worked to the X-Men's benefit. There was a time when Marvel, not content with having Logan in every single X book, decided to make him an Avenger too. This was on top of a solo comic, starring roles in multiple X-Men series and an animated show where he was given top billing. There just comes a point when you can have too much of a good thing. The question of what to do with Wolverine has proven to be one of the X-Men's most frustrating elements as of late, with the character having passed away in 2014, only to be replaced by his old man equivalent. Just a year later, the character was brought back in Marvel Legacy, stealing the spotlight away from other X-Men even as his daughter Laura had adopted the mantle and was doing a fine job of it too. Point being, Wolverine doesn't have to be everywhere. He works fine on the X-Men, individually or even as part of the Avengers, but not all at once. Number 5, the 90s show was their only good one. Marvel had a great selection of animated TV shows in the 90s, ranging from the Aerosmith-laden Spider-Man to the decidedly darker Incredible Hulk series, but its most iconic was undoubtedly the X-Men. Adapting storylines from actual X-books and fronting Jim Lee's iconic 90s redesigns, Marvel's mutants beamed their way into television sets with a blistering intro and some seriously classic X-Men stories. However, it hasn't aged spectacularly, and though it continues to be held in high regard, the claim that it's the only good X-Men cartoon would just be wrong. 2 further X-Men series came in the wake of the 90s show's cancellation, X-Men Evolution and Wolverine and the X-Men. The latter lasted for just 1 season and came during a resurgence of Marvel animation, but Evolution possessed quality and staying power in equal measure. The series, which ran from 2000 to 2003, pooled inspiration from a variety of different sources, including the then recent Ultimate Universe and even introduced X-23. Number 4, the original team. Contrary to popular belief, the most iconic incarnation of the X-Men, the one featured in 1975's giant-size X-Men #1, isn't the team's first. In actual fact, the original X-Men group was comprised of Cyclops, Jean Grey, Beast, pre-furry mishap, and Bobby Drake, aka Iceman. Wolverine and Storm wouldn't come onto the scene until the following decade, and that's really when the X-Men first gained prominence. Of course, the first wave of stories featuring the group are noteworthy. Iceman's original Snowman-esque design is still great to see, but the X-Men were truly made in the 70s onwards, as is evidenced by the sheer plethora of media that has taken inspiration from that era of X-books. Stan Lee and Jack Kirby still deserve praise for the comic's genius premise, but it's a simple truth that the concept of the X-Men evolved to such a degree that the likes of Len Wein, Dave Cockrum, and Chris Claremont deserves just as much praise for being pivotal in the team's development. Without them paving the way, it's unlikely that the franchise would be the behemoth that it is today. Number 3, Juggernaut is a mutant. Kane Marco may have been unfortunately etched into the public conscious courtesy of a trademark banter Vinnie Jones performance, but there's something else that's problematic about that portrayal. Juggernaut isn't a mutant. Marco may be the stepbrother of Professor X, but the two have next to nothing in common. Marco actually derives his powers from the Crimson Gem of Cyttorak. As a Juggernaut, he is then able to turn himself into an unstoppable force, and often ends up coming against the immovable object of Xavier's team. Ultimately, the only thing Juggernaut has in common with the X-Gene is that he's an enemy to the X-Men, and occasionally Spider-Man. He has a helmet that can resist psychic infiltration, that much is true, but he's not a mutant. Number 2, Wolverine and Sabretooth's relationship. For the last time, Wolverine and Sabretooth aren't brothers. Stop trying to make them brothers. Are they rivals? Yeah. Have they joined together on certain occasions? Also yeah, but they're not and never have been related. Granted, this particular misconception can be attributed to the groan-inducing X-Men Origins Wolverine, it's still one that's managed to worm its way into a lot of people's heads. That's probably because the brother dynamic's one of the film's few compelling elements, but still, Victor Creed and Logan aren't related. The closest thing they have in common is that they have sharp things on their hands and tend to growl a lot. Number 1. The most powerful mutant is Jean Grey. Jean Grey may have the Phoenix Force, but she is by no means the most powerful mutant in existence. Typically, the most powerful mutants in existence are referred to as Omega-level mutants. Among the most famous members of this exclusive club include Iceman, Legion, and Emma Frost, and though they all have a claim to be the most powerful X-Men out there, it is Franklin Richards, son of Mr. Fantastic and Susan Storm, who tops the list. Forget Legion's ability to change his powers on the fly, Franklin himself is the most powerful Omega-level character around, and has even been depicted as being beyond that power in the past. Sure, he may not be an actual X-Man, but Richards is still the most potent mutant going.